Hi there. I hope you're well this week. Before we analyze John Weborg's ideas of baptism and communion, let's take a bird's eye view, as usual. Our module thesis, which you can see again, is the sacraments of baptism and communion make manifest the Church's four marks. In our previous video, you parsed portions of Don Frisk's concepts of the Church and sacraments. Now, Frisk recapitulates the four marks of the Christian Church: unity, holiness, catholicity, and apostolicity, and then reviews how the Church is formed and shaped by the Word into a visible historical community. Then he enumerates the primary marks of the believer's Church and offers us the covenant's paradigms of baptism and Holy Communion at some length. After all that, we ought to briefly review John Weborg's perspective on baptism and communion as well, to round out your vision of the covenant's paradigms of both of the sacraments. So you're going to do three shorter things in this video. First off, you'll go through a portion of Weborg's primary context. Second, you'll review his perspective on baptism, tying it explicitly to the Church's ultimate holiness and catholicity. And third, you'll look with some care and at some depth at Weborg's arguments about Holy Communion, noting his special emphases on the Church's unity and holiness and alluding briefly to apostolicity, because that's also vital to our ministries at the table. So let's begin with our first goal, a little bit of his primary context. John C. Weborg, pictured on the slide, was born in Nebraska in 1937. He's an ordained minister in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Between 1975 and 2003, he was professor of theology here at the seminary, where he directed the spiritual formation program. Dr. Weborg has written a lot about pietism, which is fitting because the ECC is a pietist denomination. Useful fact, Weborg is himself a survivor of poliomyelitis, also called polio. Thus, from what I know, I've never met him, John uses a wheelchair to get around, and the seminary used to have a set of chairlifts for that purpose. The book that we're excerpting from is Made Healthy in Ministry for Ministry from 2011. Second big idea. Weborg makes three claims that are useful for our purposes in terms of baptism. First smaller claim. The baptizer, the pastor, is first and foremost a baptized one. The person authorized to baptize others doesn't do so in his or her own authority, but in God's name. Weborg makes clear both that God is a third-party witness of baptism and that baptism is never private. He comes back to that repeatedly. Baptism is communal. Plus, Weborg ties the baptizer's right to baptize to his or her identity as a child of God. He states, God's voice claimed them as beloved as it had done for Jesus, and identified with them even as it identified them, as the ones called to a special service of word and sacrament. End quote. Weborg makes very clear that pastors are not safe from the waters of baptism because one's baptism sets one apart for holiness in ways that we've defined before. Additionally, just as Frisk has done earlier, Weborg creates a really complete list of all the biblical images to which baptism bears witness. That list includes washing or cleansing, rebirth, deliverance or safety, dying or rising, God's ownership, enlightenment or illumination, clothing and a garment, incorporation into Christ's body, circumcision, seal, baptism in the sea, and identification by name for service. Having listed all these images, Weborg then describes some of them. Weborg dwells particularly on the potential of the name, that is God's name, for reflection. He observes that because we're baptized into the name of Christ, again, baptism is never ever private. He states, baptism is never a private act, just as one's life is never private. Never can a baptized person live into an adaptive version of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It does not, and it will not. Plus, in terms of the baptized person putting on the clothing of Christ, Weborg asserts that the clothing never really fits us. It's always too big, because we who love Christ never fully live into our baptisms. I will allow you to parse what Weborg says about sin, grace, guilt, and release on your own. As he continues to parse the multiple images called forth by baptism, Weborg's second big idea about that sacrament is that the baptizer, the pastor, is called to minister to a community by divine commandment, and that the command is story. In that section, Weborg describes at length the ECC's prayers in the baptismal liturgy and asserts that those prayers are actually narrating God's and Jesus' great acts in salvation, just as most baptismal prayers do. Plus, by narrating God's salvific activity over those who are baptized, the pastors and others are participating in the great narrative of God's redemption of humanity and creation. Weborg states, where Jesus' command to baptize is carried out, the story is carried on, and the same Spirit present at creation and at Jesus' baptism is now called down on this baptism of this or these people in this place. Significantly, I agree. Wherever baptism is performed, people enter into God's great story of love and justice and follow along with Jesus' footsteps to do his work. Plus, Weborg also states, in line with Galatians 3:27 and 28, that the community saved by God's grace through baptism is actually large and diverse enough to incorporate different ethnicities, skin colors, and quite possibly abilities as well. Third and finally, in terms of baptism, Weborg writes that the baptized community, called into existence by God, enacts its proclamation of the gospel in its life together, aided by each person's unique gifts. Each congregant is, by virtue of their baptism, endowed with gifts and graces to carry out a calling in the world, Weborg's words. This basically means that each person has a gift to offer the world because they're all part of Jesus' extended family. And you might remember in the prior video that Frisk said almost the exact same thing. I'm sure that none of this is new to you folks, since you're seminary students here at the ECC's seminary. So let's move on to Weborg's assertions about the bread and the wine of communion. First up, once again, Weborg claims that our position at the table as ministers is delegated. That is, people at the Lord's table can only pass on what Jesus has given them or us to say. Those of us who call Jesus our friend can really only do what Jesus has done. Importantly, one thing Jesus has done, implies wise Dr. Weborg, is welcoming and embracing people with disabilities, quote, blindness, deafness, and a whole host of psychophysical conditions that churches do not think of as a priority mission. So Weborg is saying, I think, that if those who minister are really embodying the words of promise, of which he also writes, that they should be living those words out in hospitality towards those who are different. Weborg observes that the table fellowship of communion is the extended sociology of baptism. So baptism initiates and invites people of diverse abilities into both the unity with Christ and the universality of our fellowship with all who are called and gifted in God's service. And communion is the way that we are apostled, sent out, in order to proclaim that same oneness and catholicity to a waiting world. Observe this also. At a specific point on page 80, Weborg observes, Jesus embodied difference after his resurrection, just as Easland does, and uses that to make his second claim. People who come to the Lord's table are wounded people, and they, that is we, wound each other. So the best idea is for us to let Jesus do the work of healing over the passage of time, Weborg states. Participation at the table is a place where over time the wounded free the wounders, but only after they face the wounds that have been inflicted on fellow communicants or the wounds that persons bring from various times and places. End quote. So in our unity in Christ, in our catholicity or universality, and in our holiness, in our engagement with suffering, human beings are wounded. and we bring our wounds with us to the table. But in our embodiment of the marks of the Church, we can experience the healing grace of Jesus Christ over time, and as we heal, we can in turn heal others. The table is a wonderful place because it helps us to work through our woundedness and to give ourselves and others divine grace. And third, and quite significantly in terms of Holy Communion, just as Waldenstrom does in Frisk's analysis, Weborg argues that the meal is not in memory of a dead Jesus, but an engagement, a communion with the risen Jesus Christ. That's from page 86. Jesus was not simply raptured from the tomb on Easter morning, so says Weborg. Rather, Jesus was raised and sent back. He moved from the table of the upper room to the places where his disciples were, in order to create what Weborg calls a holy human habitat, out of his weird, wonderful, and wounded body. At the Lord's table, we are one because Jesus holds us together. We are holy because Jesus sanctifies us. We are Catholic because Jesus calls us in our diverse giftedness. And we are sent out as apostles because Jesus asks all of us to use our gifts in his service. In light of all this, let's back up and recap. Our module thesis this time is: the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion make manifest the Church's 4 marks. So in this video, you attempted to demonstrate that thesis in 3 diffuse but short ways by engaging with John Weborg's claims in Made Healthy in Ministry for Ministry. You engaged with Weborg's primary context, noting that he too is a person with disabilities. You interpreted his view of baptism, taking careful note of the connection of that paradigm to the Church's holiness and catholicity, and you analyzed some of his thoughts about Holy Communion, marking its links to the Church's unity and holiness. And all of this leads us back to your single short assignment for this week. Please write me a 300-word précis of Frisk's and Weborg's concepts of baptism and Holy Communion, based on the reading and the lecture. So what do they say about the sacraments? And if possible, why do they say it? That hopefully doesn't require too much explanation, but I think that's enough for now. Whenever you're ready, please go on to the next module. Thank you.